it could help us put more Americans back to work and help us reduce our dependency on energy from abroad and help bring down this price to one that doesn't break the back of the average working families. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Dukakis.
Ask unanimous consent to rescind the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I have a correction. My staff told me that I undercounted $14 trillion. I was worried about that since and I asked ahead of time, but we actually got the number wrong. This is actually 3 zeros too few. So just to make sure the record's correct. So that's 12 zeros after 14. That reflects our national debt. I'd like to say I would have made a mistake, and it was actually lower, but it actually was much higher, which I think reinforces my point. Thank you very much.
While the senator is still here,
Senator from Alabama is recognized.
Mr. President, I would recall Senator Cornyn's a member of the Budget Committee and knowledgeable about these issues. We have had one budget actually presented to the House, and that's the President's budget to the Senate here, and scored by the Congressional Budget Office. It shows that the debt of the United States in 10 years under the President's budget would increase $13 trillion. That's $13,000 billion. I don't know if the senator is aware, but I would ask him, is he aware of how much additional revenue would come to the government if the President's proposal on corporate jet taxation were to be imposed, and would that make a difference in the $13,000 billion that would be added to the debt in the next 10 years?
Well, Mr. President, responding to my friend from Alabama, the number, as I'm advised, is roughly $3 billion in additional revenue to the Treasury, and that would be over 10 years. But as you can see, it's a drop in the bucket when it comes to the deficit for 1 year, which is $1.5 trillion, and the national debt of $14 trillion. And I apologize that I'm not used to dealing with numbers that big, and which demonstrates that these numbers really have kind of lost their meaning here. I remember Everett Dirksen being quoted as saying, "$1 million here, $1 million there." Pretty soon you're talking about real money. The fact is, we're not talking about millions, we're not talking about billions, we're talking about trillions. And I think most people's minds have a very difficult time conceiving of how big a number that is.
Well, I think, Senator, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to enter into a colloquy with my Republican colleagues for up to 30 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Senator Cornyn could join us, we'd be pleased. But Mr. President, the debt situation that we're in today is the most serious our nation has ever faced. A lot of people don't understand it and don't understand how serious it is. Even after World War II, we had growth, we had the baby boomers just becoming of age, we had more young people and fewer older people, and the situation was, even though we had debt after the war, it was more positive than it is today. That's just a fact. I have tried to look at creation of a budget that would balance in 10 years, bring us into balance in 10 years. It's hard to do. It absolutely can be done. It takes some real effort, but it can be done, and we can do it, and we've got to do it. But we've doubled the debt. President Obama, during his 4 years as president, is on track to doubling the entire debt of America in 4 years, with the 4 consecutive trillion-dollar deficits. The highest deficit we've had previously was a $450 billion deficit that President Bush had. We've had $1.2 trillion, $1,200 billion, $1,300 billion. This year, as of September 30th, when the fiscal year ends, it's estimated to be $1,500 billion or so. Debt, extra debt. We take in $2,200 billion, $2.2 trillion. We're spending $3,700 billion this year. 40 cents of every dollar that we spend this year is borrowed. It's an unsustainable course. President Obama appointed a deficit commission. He chose Erskine Bowles, who was former chief of staff to President Clinton. He chose Alan Simpson, former Republican senator. They submitted a statement to the Budget Committee, and that statement was, this country faces the most predictable economic crisis in its history. He said, we've got to act, they told us. And they said, when could this crisis happen? Mr. Bowles said it could happen within 2 years. Not our children and grandchildren. He said 2 years, maybe a little sooner, maybe a little later. And Alan Simpson popped up as co-chairman of the committee, and he said, I think it could be 1 year. In other words, some sort of economic crisis like we had in 2007, 2008, or something that could put our economy in a tailspin. It's that serious. And the debt trajectory path we're on is unsustainable. And tomorrow, I have to say, tomorrow will mark the 800th day that this Senate has not had a budget. We're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar we spend, and we've gone this long without a budget. There's no plan, apparently, to present one. The chairman of the Budget Committee, where I'm ranking Republican, tells us that he's got one, that he's talked to his colleagues, and they've agreed on it, but it remains secret. The Congressional Budget Act explicitly says we should have a budget by April 15th. It said the committee should begin markup April 1st. Well, we've not called the committee and not had a markup, and apparently there's no plan to. We're just going to wait and see if secret negotiations could produce something. That's not acceptable at a time in which the debt is the primary threat to the health, security, and welfare of our nation. There's no doubt about it. Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that the greatest threat to our national security is our debt. Secretary of State Clinton, Hillary Clinton, said a very similar thing. They are exactly right. There's no dispute about this. And so we've had nothing on the floor of the Senate except now a resolution saying we should tax the rich. A sense of the Senate that has no power, no binding authority, no numbers, no how much we're going to tax the rich, just that kind of thing. So, Mr. President, we're in a serious condition. I think the American people, if they understood how little has been done in this body this year on the most important issue facing this country, they would be even more dissatisfied with the United States Congress than they are. More dissatisfied, at least, with the Senate. Because I have to say, my colleague, our new senator from Missouri, is not new to Congress. He was the Republican whip in the House of Representatives, and the House has passed a budget this year, an honest budget, a budget that changes the debt trajectory of America in a solid way and would put us on a new path for prosperity. Everybody didn't have to agree with everything in it, but they met their responsibility by April 15th. So it's great to be with Senator Blunt. We are so pleased to have him in the Senate, but I would just ask him to, if he would share his thoughts at this time about
Well, I would, Senator, and I'm going to ask you about your sense of this budget situation.
Senator from Missouri is recognized.
I think we're in a colloquy, so do we need to be recognized, or can we recognize each other?
The Senator, the first time you stand up,
Thank
the chair should
Thank you.
acknowledge, but it's not necessary from now on.
Yeah, thank you, my friend.
Chair.
And the presiding officer and I were secretaries of state together some time ago and known each other a long time, and I'm glad to be serving with him and glad to have him in the chair as we have this discussion. But I don't think the House until the last Congress ever failed to pass a budget. I'm not sure the Senate didn't always pass a budget until the last Congress, though there were times when the House and Senate couldn't agree, but at least each side had a plan. You know, there's that old adage, when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And it sure looks like to me that's on the trajectory we're on right now. Members are more and more talking about, well, maybe we'll have another continuing resolution this year. That'll be the appropriations process because we have no plan. And, of course, as you pointed out, as a person who knows as much about the budget process as anybody in Washington, we passed the April 1 deadline, and then we passed, I guess, a May 1 date, and then we passed a June 1 date, and now we've passed a July 1 date, and we're up to that 800th day since the Senate passed a plan, since the Senate had a plan of any kind, and we're waiting for a plan to move forward with the other work of just funding the government. And clearly that's not acceptable. We see the economy, I think, continuing to wait for some signs of certainty from the federal government, certain about what our budget's going to be, certain about what our tax structure is going to be, certain about regulations and utility bills, and we're just not seeing that happen. And in fact, things are getting progressively worse and worse and worse. Gas prices have almost doubled now in the last 30 months. Unemployment's up 17%. In fact, there's no statistic I know of that's better than it was in January of 2009. And I don't know, Senator, was there ever has the Senate in the past until the last 3 years now, has there ever been a time when the Senate didn't even attempt to have a budget?
There's, to my knowledge, no time since I've been here that the Senate did not attempt to pass a budget. The first 2 years, under the last 2 years, even when our Democratic colleagues had 60 votes, the largest majority, I guess, almost in recent memory in the Senate, they did not attempt to bring a budget to the floor last year. A budget did go to committee. It was marked up by Senator Conrad. It came to the floor, but Majority Leader Reid decided not to bring it up. This year, I think, at his decision, probably, it seems to be so, Senator Conrad was told not to have a markup, not to even produce a budget in committee. And it seems to me, Senator Blunt, that indicates a lack of willingness to lead, because wouldn't you agree a budget sets your priorities? It demonstrates what your vision for the future of the country is and what we should spend and what we should tax. and how much debt we can afford to run up, and those are fundamental responsibilities. And how would you evaluate the fact that for 2 years, tomorrow, 800 days without a budget? What does it say about the leadership that we've seen here in the Senate?
Well, it shows we have 800 days without a budget, but basically we have 800 days without any structured process of how we spend the people's money. 800 days where, well, let's just go to the last time we could come up with an appropriations process, and we'll modify that a little bit and move forward. And that clearly is not good enough. And in that 800 days, as you pointed out, in that 800 days, we've gone to where we're now, we've added 35% in a little over 800 days, 35% in 2.5 years to the federal deficit. This is not defending anybody else's effort to make the revenue and the expenditures of the federal government balance, but you can't continue to spend more than you have. And if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a blueprint, if you don't have a budget, like families have to have a budget, you sit down, and if you don't have a budget, at the very least, if you're managing your money, you sit down once a month and write the checks until the money runs out, and you can't do much more than that. And we're at a point now that, we're spending $3.7, $3.8 trillion. We're collecting $2.2 trillion. And I'm sort of like Senator Cornyn on this topic. And by the way, everybody else is too, including the Secretary of the Treasury. And nobody knows how much money this is. But we do all know if you're making $22,000 a year and you're spending $37,000 a year, and you've already borrowed more money than probably anybody should have ever lent you, you can't continue to do that. At some point, there has to be a moment where you say, we're going to have to get real here, and we're making $22,000. We better start spending no more than $22,000, and that includes paying off the money that we've already borrowed when we were spending $37,000. There are so many zeros and so many numbers here that if any of us really understood how much money we're talking about and how long it will take to pay it back, we'd all be more scared than we are. And certainly the people we work for would be more scared than they are, because we're doing irresponsible things, and as irresponsible as any of those things is not having a plan. And I know all the years you've spent on the Budget Committee and your leadership on that committee now, you don't know what to do if you don't have a plan, and the appropriations process doesn't move forward unless we agree first how much money we're going to spend in that process. And so eventually you just go back and say, well, let's just go back to last year and modify slightly the terrible job we did last year and just borrow that much more money again, and that is not acceptable.
Well, I'd like in a moment for you to share some thoughts from your extensive experience in the leadership of the Congress about the appropriations process. Just briefly make sure that the American people and our colleagues know what's happened. But I see our colleague from Wisconsin, Senator Ron Johnson, newly elected. He had I think you could say, an upset victory, a popular big victory. He went out and campaigned all over his state. Talked about the issues we're talking about today. And Senator Johnson, as a new member of the Senate, I'd love to hear your comments about where you think we are today and how you feel about it.
Well, Senator Sessions, first of all, thank you for your leadership on this issue. I know you've been talking loud and clear about the fact that we should not have recessed this week. And I know President Obama tried to claim credit for that, but it's because of your leadership and really the members of the Republican conference here in the Senate that we said, no, we're bankrupting America. We need to stay here and we need to start debating this issue. And unfortunately, that is not really what we've been doing this week. It's sad. One word that I use all the time now that I've come here to Washington is unbelievable. It's simply unbelievable that tomorrow will mark 800 days that we haven't passed a budget. That's unbelievable. My background is in business for the last 34 years. I've had to produce budgets on time. I've had people produce budgets for me on time. In business, even a small little business, it's inconceivable that you'd tell an accountant, you know, to say, hey, okay, now make sure your budget's, you know, we need to have that on our desk on April 15th. I would say 99.9% of those accountants, those controllers would have a budget on time on April 15th. And we're dealing with the United States of America. We're talking about our financial future here, the fate of America. And the Democrats here in the Senate have failed to meet that obligation 2 years in a row. I mean, it's simply unbelievable. It's so incredibly irresponsible. I think the Senate has been guilty of willful neglect. I think the phrase I've been using, the Senate has been fiddling while America's going broke. And that's sad. And now I think, as you pointed out as well, what does the financial future of America rest on? Some secret talks? Talks between a few individuals going on behind closed doors, far from the view of the American public. And rather than an orderly process where a plan is presented that can be viewed by the American public, that can be debated in open, the way our founders envisioned on the floor of the Senate, this historic floor, instead of using the process that we should have been using, what's going to happen? Are we going to have a result, a negotiated settlement, dropped in our lap, what, a couple days before, you know, this deadline date? Is that what's going to happen? Is that really how the financial fate of America is going to be decided? I mean, personally, I find that process disgusting. That's why I stood up last Tuesday on the floor of the Senate and I said, unless we start seriously addressing this problem, the bankrupting of America, in the open, in the bright light of day, I was going to begin to object. I was going to begin to withhold my consent. And I tell you, I was heartened by the support I got by my Republican colleagues because, let's face it, we understand how urgent the situation is. We understand how difficult it is. We are willing to sit down and work with anybody who will seriously address the fact that we are driving America toward bankruptcy. But we need a willing partner. And up to this point in time, I haven't seen one. I mean, the fact that the only plan that we've seen is the President's budget. You know, 4 1/4 inches thick, 2,400 pages long. How many thousands of man-hours did that document take to produce? It was so unserious, it would have added more than $12 trillion to our nation's debt in the next 10 years. It would have continued the bankrupting of America. It would have made us go broke. It was so unserious, it failed here in the United States Senate by a vote of 0 to 97. Not one Democrat senator found that bill serious enough to give it a vote. That's the only plan I've seen. I woke up this morning to a couple news reports, and there was more detail about what the administration might plan to do fed to reporters than fed to a member of Congress. I'm sorry to be so blunt about this, but that is a disgusting process. The American people deserve far better. And I guess today what I'm standing up here asking, I want to see a plan, and I want to see a budget, and I want to see it to give us enough time so we can actually analyze it, and we can debate it, and we can pass the real structural reforms that we can actually solve this problem. And I'm calling on the President, I'm calling the Democrats in this Senate to produce that plan so we can have an open debate on it. That's kind of how I'm thinking.
Yeah. Senator Sessions,
yes.
let me say about that, I'd like to say to both you and Senator Johnson, who were primary leaders in this idea that we shouldn't go home, that Republicans shouldn't vote to adjourn, that you were going to object to things that didn't relate to the business we need to do, and of course that's right. And as you were talking, Senator Johnson, I was thinking the other deadline, the other April the 15th deadline, every American had better comply with that one, and it's in the law just like the one that we're supposed to comply with. What if everybody in America decided they were going to miss their legal deadline as well? Okay, we're not going to have a budget, we're not going to pay our taxes. Of course, they'd be in big trouble. And the Senate's not in trouble, but the country is in trouble because the Senate's not doing its job. And neither the House or the Senate did their jobs in the last Congress for the first time ever. And so that's how we go now into 3 years of no budget, 3 years since we had a working document, that we should have to work with, and that's important. And what do we do this week? Now, the disappointment to all three of us is we said we want to stay this week and deal with these issues, and what did we deal with? We started out by trying to deal with a Libya resolution that apparently wasn't important enough to deal with last Thursday when we were going to take a week to be working in our states, but we'll debate the Libya resolution. And then when people on the Republican side said, we really think we ought to be debating the reason we were supposed to stay, we still don't do that. We have this amendment that was even, I think it was supposed to be and is a sense of the Senate that millionaires aren't paying enough taxes. Now, we all understand the politics of that, just like we understand the politics of no accelerated depreciation for business airplanes. Now, whenever that was done, it was done to try to create more American jobs quicker by a little more demand. I think how that works, you depreciate that plane in 5 years instead of 7 to encourage people to go ahead and buy a plane and keep people who make planes at work. But let's assume that, what is that, $3 billion over 10 years? We're borrowing $4 billion today, and we try to have this debate as if it's about $3 billion over 10 years. We're borrowing $4 billion today, and we want to have this false debate about who's not paying their share. We're spending too much money is the problem. The problem is not that we're not taxing enough. We're spending almost 25% of the capacity of the country to produce goods and services. Until the beginning of 2009, for 40 years, we never spent, the average was 20.6. $1 out of $5 was going to the federal government, not 1 out of 4. And I was asked by some reporters yesterday, well, why is this so different than other times when the debt limit's been increased? And you mentioned one of them earlier. One of the differences is we've added 35% to the debt in about 30 months. 35% to the debt in 30 months. And another one is the federal government is suffocating the economy by spending too much money. There's no money left for people to borrow and take a risk and create a job and create an opportunity for somebody else. And on the millionaire tax thing, 1% of all the taxpayers pay 38% of all the taxes now. Now, maybe we ought to get to where 1 or 2% just pay all the taxes. We already have 47% of the individuals in the country pay no income tax. And by the way, you value what you pay for. And if you don't pay any income tax, you don't care about the income tax as much as if you did. So there aren't as many people out there fighting excessive taxation because they have less of a stake in it. But 1% of the people in the country already pay 38% of the income taxes, and 10% pay 70%. Maybe we just ought to let that 10% pay 100%. I guess that would get all the millionaires and the billionaires. And I remember the tax. Remember the millionaire's tax that only like 155 people would pay or something? It was the alternative minimum tax. 155 people were going to pay that millionaire's tax. And now some huge percentage of all Americans pay it, because eventually, once you start down this path, everybody is impacted by higher tax rates. And the frustration of being here and not doing anything all week, we had one vote to compel the members who didn't come to the Senate, and another vote was a cloture on a bill that doesn't matter. You know, the frustration of your leadership and then that result is pretty incredible to me. But thanks to both of you for insisting for weeks before last week that we should stay and have a discussion, a debate, a vote on the things that matter. And I'm sorry that we didn't have that, particularly based on your intensity for the part of both of you of insisting that we have that kind of debate this week, and we didn't have it.
Well, Senator Blunt, I'd like to pick up on your point in terms of how unserious this week has been. Just a comparison to businesses. About 5 years ago, I bought a business out of bankruptcy, and I watched those business owners over the course of 2 or 3 years struggle to make a go of that business. You would not believe the number of hours those people, those hardworking Americans, put in to save that business. It didn't work. They went into reorganization under the bankruptcy laws. I bought that business out of bankruptcy. I saw how incredibly hard my team worked to make that business survive, and it did survive. I mean, these are individuals putting in 16, 17, 18, 20 hours a day to make a product, to build a good life for themselves and their family, to provide employment, jobs. This is the American spirit. That's the entrepreneurial spirit. That's what Americans do day in and day out, whether you own a business or whether you contribute your effort, your labor to make your business successful, the one you work for successful. That's what Americans do. What has this president done? What has this Congress, what has this Senate done? In the last 6 months since I've been here, we've passed 6 laws, 6 bills that have become law. 3 of those had to do with the continuing resolutions of last year's business. Funding the government for this year, those were laws that were passed, should have been passed a year ago. But it was left over for us to do that. We had 2 bills to extend the Patriot Act. If you take a look at how that was even done, last minute, rush. Very little time for debate. You really couldn't even get amendments in there. And then, of course, the other one is we kind of cleaned up a little bit, just a little part of the health care law that dealt with 1099s would have been a nightmare. It would have cost billions of dollars to comply and not brought in any revenue. So we finally got that off the books, thankfully. The other bills we debated here, we spent 16 weeks debating 3 bills. The total dollar amount of those bills is $20 billion. That's about 0.5% of what this federal government will spend this year. So we've spent 16 weeks debating 0.5% of our $3.6 trillion a year budget. Now that, in my mind, is the definition of being not serious. And of course, you've said it's been $7.99. Tomorrow's going to be 800 days since we've actually passed a budget. And so now this week we've spent 15 hours of debate. We called it a sense of the Senate resolution. It really should be called the nonsense of the Senate. I mean, that's what's been occurring this week, and it's a tragedy. It is a tragedy. But again, that's why I stood up and started to object, and I will continue to do that until we actually start getting serious, until we actually see a plan, a budget that we can start debating.
Well, let me just note that we have a sense of the Senate resolution on the floor. We had a cloture vote on it, and I think everybody voted to go to the bill. That's what the leader wanted to do. But it's really nothing, because if it passes, it has no impact and no change whatsoever. It basically says we should tax the rich more. And we can debate these issues, but I would just note that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which is an organization for the developed world businesses, and they do analysis and that sort of thing. It's a European-based group, has concluded that the United States has the most progressive tax system in the world. Now, we always thought the Europeans were more hostile to wealth and more socialistic than we were, but that's their analysis. And as Senator Blunt said, how much more do we want them to pay? Maybe they should pay more. Let's debate it. Let's talk about it. But that's not going to fix our problem. Senator Johnson, you ran, you're a successful businessman and accountant. I've seen your work. I'm so glad you're on the Budget Committee. I guess you and Senator Enzi are the only accountants around here. And we're glad you're there, and I've seen your work. He actually adds up numbers. Senator Blunt got charts about how spending works. He showed me one this morning, trying to figure out a way to change America. But I guess my first comment to you is, you're a successful businessman. You've never been a politician before. Why did you run?
Well, the reason I ran is because we're bankrupting the nation. I love America. We love America. And when I watch what's happening, and when I saw how broken Washington is, when I saw him pass the health care law, that from my standpoint, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Our first child, my daughter Carrie, was born with a very serious congenital heart defect. Dedicated doctors and surgeons saved her life the first day, and then 8 months later, when her heart was the size of a plum, another dedicated surgeon, team medical professionals totally reconstructed the upper chamber of her heart. Her heart operates backwards now. But she's 28 years old and she's a nurse herself in a neonatal intensive care unit. And when I heard President Obama say that, these doctors, they'll take out a set of tonsils for a few extra bucks, I found that outrageous. And then when this Congress and this President signed the health care law, I know the result of that. It is designed to lead to a government takeover of our health care system. And all we have to do is take a look at Canada and Britain. We don't have to theorize what that's going to result in. It'll lower the quality of care. It will result in rationing. And the medical innovation that saved my daughter's life and millions of others, it really is America where medical miracles are created. I think that innovation is going to come to a grinding halt. So that's just the quality aspect of the health care bill, but it is going to destroy our budget. I wrote a piece with Douglas Holtz-Aiken, ex-CBO director. Rather than $93 billion a year, when this thing kicks in as it's designed to do, and a large percentage of Americans lose their health care employer coverage, gets dumped in exchanges, we're talking about $500 billion, or maybe $900 billion. But I see we're running out of time, but that's why I ran, because we're bankrupting America, Senator.
Senators have used 30 minutes.
I would ask unanimous consent that I be given one additional minute.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I just want to say we have in this colloquy Senator Blunt, who's a second-ranking Republican leader in the House and who has dealt with these issues for many, many years. We are so glad to have him in the Senate. And Senator Johnson, a new senator, passionate and concerned about the future of America, both of them. And I think that American people should be proud of the service they've rendered. And really, we have to change. And I believe that we can, and we're going to keep fighting toward that end. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
President. Senator from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the presiding officers recognizing me, and I was kind of switched places with him earlier. I was in the chair and listened to some comments from a number of senators on the other side of the aisle. And I didn't come to the floor to talk about this, but I just can't help myself sometimes. And I heard these comparisons between, and it all started when they talked about the economy. It all started January 20th, 2009. And they compared on that day with today. What they left out of that picture is that when Barack Obama became president, this economy was going like this. It wasn't like, he's president, now things will get better. The 30 days after he was sworn in on January 20, 2009, we lost 700,000 jobs in this country. The next 30 days, we lost somewhere in excess of, I believe, 600,000 jobs. The point is, for the first several months before President Obama could almost take a breath, and before Congress, the House and Senate, controlled by Democrats then, could actually put a program in place and put policies in place that would respond to this terrible, terrible, terrible economy bequeathed to them and to us by this sort of Republican, this Republican economic policy, tax cuts for the rich, 2 wars that aren't paid for, a giveaway to the drug and insurance industry, bailout to the drug and insurance industry in the name of Medicare privatization, privatization or deregulation of Wall Street, tax cuts that went overwhelmingly to the richest Americans. That's what got us into this. And for them to say, look at the number of jobs today, look at the number of jobs January 2009, is they know that's a specious argument. They're disingenuous. They're not especially honest when they make that argument. The fact is, we have seen the last 14 months, and I wish it were better. I went to Barberton, Ohio this week and was at a plant expansion with 30 jobs. It's not enough. I wish it were 300. It's an Alcoa plant. They're hiring people. They're paying okay wages. I wish they were paying better wages. I wish they could hire more people. But we're seeing progress. But in the last 14 months, they forgot to tell you this, we're seeing job growth every month, including manufacturing job growth, the lifeblood of the economy in my state. We're the 3rd leading manufacturing state, only behind Senator Cornyn's state and Senator Boxer and Feinstein's state, in the number of manufacturing jobs and their output. The point is, let's be honest when we have this discussion. We know our policies aren't working as fast as we'd like, but we know what their policies brought us. 21 million private sector jobs created during the 8 years of Bill Clinton. Then, when they put in the Bush economic policies, tax cuts for the wealthy, twice, 2 wars not paying for them, privatization of partial privatization of Medicare, deregulation of Wall Street, 1 million private sector jobs created in 8 years. 21 million versus 1 million. Tell that story, too, Mr. President. I'm not saying that we have every answer. We don't. But we're making progress in spite of their saying no to everything that we're trying to do. But we've got to look at the future, because the middle class, the biggest problem we have in this country today is the decline of the middle class, and we've got to address that. That's why I came to the floor today, Mr. President, because even though we're in the midst of this budget debate, as everyone's talking about, the focus has to stay on job creation. It has to be, how do we create jobs in this country? One way not to create jobs, Mr. President, is what Senator Casey talked about an hour or so ago, and that is 3 new trade agreements that too many people on both sides of the aisle want to foist on the American people. This morning, the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee are both having what are called mock markups of free trade deals with 3 countries, South Korea, in Asia, Colombia, and Panama in our hemisphere. The Senate Finance Committee is including trade adjustment assistance. The House doesn't even care to take care of workers who lose their jobs because of these trade agreements. They're expendable. They're a bunch of 50-year-olds that don't have much education, and if they lose their jobs, who care? Well, that's really what they're saying in the House Ways and Means Committee. We'll pass these 3 trade agreements, but if people lose their jobs, there's nothing we can do to help them. Well, really, there is, and we've had something called trade adjustment assistance for 50 years. It's been bipartisan until this group of radicals that run the House of Representatives and decide we don't want trade adjustment assistance anymore. But look what's happened. In the last decade alone, 6 million good-paying manufacturing jobs, 55,000 manufacturing plants have been lost. Multinational companies are too easily setting up operations overseas, exporting products back to the U.S. market. Think about this, Mr. President. Is there any time in world history where the most compelling business plan for a company is shut down what you do in your home country, move production far, far away to another country where you have lower wages, fewer regulations, a government that's not exactly free, make those products there and sell them back to the home country. This business plan that so many American companies follow is move production overseas where you can get cheap labor and weak regulations in a totalitarian government, and then sell those products back to the home country. That's a business plan that far too many American companies have obviously followed. But manufacturing now accounts for less than 10% of employment in our country, and that's partly because of NAFTA, it's partly because of CAFTA, it's partly because of China permanent normal trade relations. They only accelerated this decline, and our economy pays for it today. The public has heard promises of job creation from trade deals before, every single time. NAFTA would create this many jobs, CAFTA would create this many jobs, PNTR with China would mean more prosperity, more jobs for Americans. The Korea deal is the same. Is more of the same. The U.S. International Trade Commission projects that the Korean Free Trade Agreement will increase the U.S. global trade deficit. The Economic Policy Institute estimates the loss of at least 150,000 jobs from this agreement. The Korea Pact has unusually low rules of origin, allowing manufacturing goods containing up to 65% of components from China or any other country to obtain the benefits of the agreement. So what happens, Mr. President, is a company in Seoul, South Korea, after this trade agreement would pass, if it does, would contract with the Chinese. 65% of the product would come from China, be sold into South Korea. South Korea puts its value added, sends it to the United States, duty-free, tariff-free, even though 65% of it was made in China. Pundits in the editorial board say that these are no-brainers. They say that trade adjustment assistance is just a payoff to workers for passing more job-killing trade agreements. The Washington Post editorial board, always a creative thinker of the future, and wrong in their predictions on war, wrong in their predictions on trade, wrong in their predictions on labor law, but nonetheless, the Washington Post editorial board called TAA a consolation prize. Once again, Washington gets it wrong, because, you know, not very many editorial writers of the Washington Post frankly have lost their jobs to trade agreements, so they don't seem all that interested in people in Steubenville and people in Lima and people in Zanesville who actually have lost their jobs because of these trade agreements, which the Washington Post editorial board always supports. We need to focus on retraining workers who were displaced because of past free trade deals, but even this historically bipartisan program, as I'd said earlier, is suddenly becoming controversial. It was operated through numerous administrations. It was supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. It ensures that workers who lose their jobs and their financial security as a result of globalization have an opportunity to transition to new jobs in emerging sectors of the economy. It helps retrain workers for new opportunities. In 2010 fiscal year, 225,000 workers participated in TAA, receiving training for jobs that employers are looking to fill. It's common sense. Senator Casey and I have stood on this floor, he in that row, I in this row, repeatedly asking our colleagues to extend this vital job training program. Under the rules of the Senate, one of them stands up and objects. Time and time and time again. We did get a 6-week extension, but since mid-February, this part of the trade adjustment assistance is simply not available to so many people in New Mexico and in Ohio and in Pennsylvania and across the country. Senator Casey and I introduced the TAA bill last week that would extend TAA for 5 years. We paid for it. We know it's no panacea for bad trade agreements. It's not the price workers in my state want to pay while Congress passes more trade deals. We must stand up for workers before even considering new trade agreements, and we must focus on real job creation. And a big part of that is standing up against China's unfair currency regime that they have inflicted on this world trade, on this world trade regimen for a number of years. With our trade deficit also comes trading partners manipulating their currency to undermine our manufacturers. Some of our trading partners have repeatedly found ways to circumvent trade law to gain an unfair advantage. In 2010, our trade deficit was $634 billion. That means every single day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, every single day, we buy more than $1.5 billion more in goods than we sell internationally. With China, our trade deficit was $273 billion. That means several $100 million every day we purchase from China more than we sell to China every single day. And President Bush once said that a $1 billion trade surplus or a $1 billion trade deficit translates into 13,000 jobs. So think about that. If we have a trade deficit of $1 billion, according to President Bush, these aren't my numbers, President Bush, who supports both President Bush has supported these, by and large, have supported most of these trade agreements. If we have a $1 billion trade deficit, we lose 13,000 jobs, mostly manufacturing, in states like Indiana and Ohio and New Mexico and around the country. So do the math. If our trade deficit is $200 billion with China, we know what that means. 10 years ago, our trade deficit in goods with China was $68 billion. So these geniuses that come up with these trade agreements, supported by the editorial board, supported by Harvard economists, supported by presidents, supported by pundits that are in Washington and probably don't much get outside of Washington. These agreements, we had a $68 billion trade deficit with China when the most effective corporate lobbyists in the history of the world came to this institution, came to the House and Senate, and sold a majority of House and Senate members that PNTR with China was a good idea. We had a $68 billion trade deficit with China then. Now it's $273 billion. They told us that, we're going to sell more goods, we're going to do better with our deals with China when we have this. So, Mr. President, in the last couple of minutes, I would point out Senator Snowe and I have proposed bipartisanly the Currency Reform for Fair Trade Act to ensure that our trade deficit isn't further increased when countries like China manipulate their currency to make their exports less expensive so they can break into our market and keep us out of their market. The legislation passed overwhelmingly in the House last year. Our bill would strengthen countervailing duty laws to consider undervalued currency as an unfair trade subsidy in determining duty rates. So in Ohio industry, coated paper industry in Hamilton, Ohio, steel industry in Lorain, Ohio, aluminum industry in Sydney, Ohio, when they petition the International Trade Commission for relief, they can talk about, include in that petition, the charge of currency manipulation. The bill sends a signal to our trading partners. We're not going to sit there while countries gain the unfair advantage over American workers and businesses. Before pursuing, Mr. President, more free trade agreements, let's focus on enforcement. Let's focus on addressing currency manipulation. Let's level the playing field so we can fight back and we can stop this terrible hemorrhaging of American manufacturing jobs. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. President, today, and in fact probably just concluding, congressional leadership on both sides of the aisle here are meeting with the President to try to break this current impasse on the debt talks. As the President said in a press conference earlier this week, right now, and I quote, "Right now we've got a unique opportunity to do something big." I couldn't agree with that statement any more than I have. I'm glad and pleased that finally, after months of concern and months of urging, we are dealing with this impending debt crisis. Time is running out. The leadership is now meeting. We'll be getting reports on what has come from that. I was encouraged by initial reports today indicating the President has agreed to address the issues of entitlement spending as well as defining the amount of spending cuts that are necessary to put together a credible plan that will see us into a better financial future for all of us, and particularly for this country. I've been discussing the necessity for a comprehensive solution to our problem ever since practically day one of this session in my return to the Senate, indicating that the current process of spending way beyond our means simply cannot be maintained and sustained, and that we have to address it, not after 2012, but address it now. And so I'm encouraged by the talks that are now going on that are beginning to incorporate the elements that I think there is growing consensus, if not almost total consensus, have to be a part of this initiative for it to be successful, to be deemed credible, and for it to avoid the potentially catastrophic consequences of defaulting on our debt and losing our credibility as the place to invest your money for the best safety that you can get. I don't have to go through the math, spending again, but I will just briefly, spending $3.7 trillion a year when you are only taking in $2.2 trillion a year is simply unsustainable and is driving us toward the cliff of bankruptcy and inability to pay our debts. A big driver of that, and the biggest driver of that debt, is clearly the mandatory spending that comes with entitlements. It's no secret we have seen the baby boom generation move through the economy from birth now to retirement, and the programs that were put in place and the promises that were made in terms of benefits to those beneficiaries are not going to be available if we don't address the impending bankruptcy of these programs. Those that have analyzed this have basically said, look, you've got to do something now to keep these programs from going broke in the future. So all of those who say, don't touch my Medicare, don't touch my Social Security, don't do anything, are essentially saying we're willing to ride it out for 2 or 3 more years and then see the whole thing collapse. Those of us that are saying let's do something sensible and rational now, not taking away any benefits from current beneficiaries, by the way, but doing something that will preserve these programs to the future is absolutely essential. We're trying to save Social Security. We're trying to save Medicare. And we're trying to do the kind of things that are necessary with our mandatory spending to address this total imbalance in place that is driving them into insolvency. So I would hope today that what we hear back from this meeting at the White House is a commitment to go forward with a comprehensive approach, including necessary cuts, duplications of programs, redundancies, fraud and abuse, things we just simply can't afford anymore, combined with an element of dealing with entitlements in a responsible way and the mandatory spending, putting in the right enforcement mechanisms in place so that we don't renege on our commitments that we make, and also incorporating comprehensive tax reform. For months, the focus has been on cutting spending and tax increases. And we've realized that I think another growing consensus is that without comprehensive tax reform, we're not going to be able to address and solve this problem. The administration has, I believe, also begun to recognize this and acknowledge that comprehensive tax reform is necessary. Yesterday, Senator Wyden and I sent a letter to President Obama and to the congressional leaders that are participating in today's debt ceiling talks, urging them to include a timeline for comprehensive tax reform. The bill that Senator Wyden and former Senator Gregg put together after 2 painstaking years of negotiations, which I have joined now in Senator Gregg's place after he retired from the Senate, and we've made some modifications of this, is a bipartisan effort to deal with comprehensive tax reform, to go after the 10,000 special breaks in interests and credits and exceptions that are made there for special interest, and to incorporate the savings from that into lower rates to make the private sector more competitive, which we know will bring about growth in the economy and ultimately jobs for the American people, is a necessary component of that. The President's Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform found that resolving the nation's debt crisis demands comprehensive structural change, including, they said, tax reform. There's no better way to raise revenue and reduce the deficit than by growing the economy and putting Americans back to work. And done right, tax reform will create those good-paying jobs and provide businesses and families with the certainty they need to plan for the future. Any revenues raised by closing tax loopholes should be part of a comprehensive plan that reduces tax rates for American families and businesses and creates jobs. I want to repeat that. The whole theory behind this is to take those special interests and exemptions that have been incorporated into the tax code over a 15, 20-year period of time to the total of 10,000 special exemptions, to take a selective portion of that and a significant portion of that and eliminate or reduce those to gain the revenues, allowing us to reduce tax rates on American families and on American businesses so that those businesses can be more competitive, those families will have more discretionary spending. Our businesses currently rank 35 out of 36 in terms of the highest tax rates imposed, some of the highest in the world, and we compete around the world with those countries that are producing the same products, but yet their tax rates are significantly lower than ours, and that puts us at a competitive disadvantage. We can make the best products in the world, and we can outsell anybody in the world if we put our companies and our businesses on a level playing field. And the whole structure and purpose behind the Wyden-Coach tax reform bill is to do just that, to put us on a competitive basis with our competitors by lowering the rates and gaining the revenue to pay for that by ending a lot of these exclusions that have been put in place just for the benefit of a few and not for the many. So we know this won't be easy, and we know it requires Democrats and Republicans to work together to take on the special interests that currently benefit from the broken tax system. And we know that right now that seems very difficult and very challenging. But it's been done before. We had a 1986 tax reform that stimulated the economy in ways that no stimulus has ever done before, brought in significant additional revenues to the Treasury, and put Americans back to work. And so Senator Wyden and I, because this is a bipartisan bill, a Democrat from Oregon and a Republican from Indiana have joined forces with this. We want to signal that this is something that can be done aside from political gotchas, aside from political gain for the 2012 election, and something that we can work together on that will make a commitment to a substantial portion of the necessary action that needs to be taken place in dealing with this impending debt crisis and deficit crisis that has to be resolved by August 2nd or close to that. Some say it can't be done in the time that's left. Well, we're at extraordinary times, and I think we have to set aside the conventional thinking and try to work toward what can and must be done. But to the extent that it can't be fully incorporated into the law, at the very least, I believe that the package that we're ultimately going to be voting on here needs a rock-hard, firm commitment and instructions to the tax-writing committees that this must be done and presented to the Congress in this session so that we can address it and so that we eliminate the uncertainty as to whether we're going to go forward. And it needs an enforcement backup mechanism so that if Congress doesn't act in a timely manner, there will be an automatic process that takes place that does this and presents it to us for a vote. We have a unique opportunity to do something big, to quote the President again. And I commend him for saying that. And I commend him for coming forward saying, we will get off this cut-only, tax-only stalemate process, and we will begin to address this on a comprehensive basis and put in place those elements that we all know are necessary to achieve success. It will require the House and the Senate and the White House to cast aside political posturing in the 2012 elections, to transcend the politics, to do what is necessary for the future of America, for the future of Americans, to do what is necessary to get our finances and our economy moving again and to get people back to work. We need to transcend that political and do what is right for the future of our country. And Mr. President, I hope we have taken a positive step in that direction today, and I look forward to participating, as I know all of us do, in that process and hopefully assure the American people and ensure the world that America is not at stalemate, that America can address a challenge, a big challenge, and we can come forward with a sensible solution that puts us on the path to prosperity and guarantees a better future for our children and grandchildren. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.